Jason pushed open the glass doors of the supermarket, entering a familiar space filled with light and smells. He'd always loved this moment, the moment when he left the noisy world behind him and immersed himself in the world of familiar products and brands. The whole routine calmed him down, made him feel like the master of the situation. He was more confident than ever. To him, the stores were as familiar as the streets of his neighborhood. He could walk past the racks without thinking about how to navigate this world, a world where he was just a customer, ready to take what he needed and leave. He wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary tonight. Jason stopped by to pick up a couple things for home, already thinking through how the evening would end over another game or with friends at a cafe. There was no room in his head for deep thoughts or problems. Just the usual worries: how to pick out that particular yogurt, what chips to buy, and how to finish this hike quickly. He picked up the cart and started moving down the aisle of cool drinks. Bag with his phones and wallet in his pocket, he felt again how heavy on his mind it was to have to choose exactly the drink you wanted. He decided to ignore every corner and every shelf. The noise behind him and the people moving around him didn't interest him. But suddenly, in one of the aisles, his gaze fell on a man standing by a shelf of pasta. The old man was truly old. Gray hair, wrinkles on his face, an expression that might have been calm if it hadn't been for the long moments when he just stood there, staring at the pasta stacks. Jason squinted, continuing to move past him. The old man looked like he was part of the furniture, part of these grocery shelves, a meaningless backdrop to a standard shopping trip. Jason's gaze lingered, and in that moment he felt irritated. Why stand there and waste time choosing? Time was money, and the old man, he looked like he wasn't in a hurry for anything anymore. The teenager, like all his peers, was used to a fast rhythm. Lingering in one place was not for him. And now, as the old man continued to stand motionless, irritated thoughts began to arise in his mind. This didn't seem right to him. There was no place in his world for slow people. Why couldn't the old man just walk on by? He continued down the hallway, but his gaze returned to the old man. It was strange. Why wasn't he moving like everyone else? Why didn't he notice that everyone around him was in a hurry? With each step Jason became more and more certain that he had to say something, do something, to remind this old man that time was of the essence. Soon that irritation turned to desire. A desire to say something. Maybe a joke. Maybe something hurtful, but light. There was no room in his teenage mind for remorse, for thinking about the consequences. He hadn't expected that those few words could change everything. Moving closer, Jason stood next to the man, not thinking about what was going on. He took a step forward and said without embarrassment, "Hey, old man, how are you even standing in this store? Why are you taking so long? Don't you realize people are pissed off about this?" And in that moment, as the words came out of his mouth, without realizing the full force of their impact, his heart almost stopped. But it was too late. Jason hadn't expected anything unusual. He was used to seeing people going about their business, all the same faces as his, the same impassive, tired faces. But as his gaze slid over the pasta shelf, his attention was suddenly drawn to one man. It was an old man, a black-skinned man with a high posture, standing in the shadow of the shelf. It was as if he didn't belong here. Everything around him was ordinary, but his figure stood out from the background. The old man stood as still as a statue, gazing into the packages on the shelf, but his eyes seemed to see more than just pasta. His gaze was sharp, penetrating, as if he wasn't just selecting products, but analyzing every element around him. Jason couldn't figure out what it was about that look that attracted him. He'd thought old men didn't notice anything but their slow walk and routine concerns, but this man was different. He immediately felt something cold run over his skin. The old man seemed perfectly calm, but his calm wasn't the kind of calm Jason was used to seeing in older people. It wasn't just silence, but confidence, the kind of confidence you want to retreat from without knowing why. He stood there, unmoving, and seemed to know everything that was going on around him. Jason looked at him again, this time with irritation. He couldn't understand what had made him pay attention to this man. The old man was like a part of the interior, a faceless figure among hundreds of other customers. But there was something special in his eyes, something that clung to him like an icy wind, keeping him from relaxing. The boy leaned forward and looked at the old man more closely. He caught a glimpse of the deep wrinkles on his face and the white hair in a neat knot at the back of his head. He was old, it was obvious, but there was something about his stance, the way he held himself, that made Jason feel as if the old man were an important part of something much bigger than just a customer in front of a shelf of merchandise. And then something unusual happened. The old man turned his head in his direction, as if he sensed his gaze. Their eyes met. It was an instant, but it was so profound that Jason felt his body tense. He would have averted his gaze if not for the feeling that the old man saw him as more than just a guy with a lustful expression on his face, but something more. Something that would make him feel small and insignificant. Empty. And in that moment, as Jason tried to figure out what was happening, his heart suddenly sank. The old man didn't smile, didn't say a word, but something in his eyes made Jason wonder. It was as if that look could read his mind, see something in him that he was trying to hide. He could have stopped for a second, apologized, even just kept silent, but no. Instead, Jason felt a growing irritation. He figured the old man was just biding his time, as old men usually did, but he felt uneasy. He nervously adjusted his cap, his fingers slid nervously across the shelf, and he glanced at the old man again. He wanted to see something else, something that would confirm his mental pattern that this old man was just an insignificant figure among the crowd. But that gaze wouldn't let him go. Everything he knew had receded into the background. He no longer saw the old man as just a man on a shelf. There was something more in his eyes. And Jason, despite the urge to turn and walk away, couldn't take his eyes away any longer. Before we continue, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from. Have you had moments in your life when you faced something similar? It will be interesting to hear how you have experienced such moments. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new exciting stories. And now we continue. With every moment spent with this old man, Jason felt his patience wearing thin. He couldn't understand why this man wasn't moving, why he continued to stand at the shelf, making no choice. It was taking too long, too slow. It was beginning to piss him off. A mixture of irritation and anger was building in the teenager's mind, and more he could feel the tension growing. At first it had been barely perceptible impulses, almost intangible, a slight worry that someone was disrupting the rhythm of his day. But now these impulses became real thoughts that intensified with every glance at the old man. He was sure that the old man probably wasn't in a hurry because he was used to wasting time on nothing, as if the whole world was as slow to him as his own steps. Jason glanced at his watch. He knew for sure that he had to move on, that he still had other things to do. He felt his fingers begin to grip the handle of the cart nervously. But the old man kept standing there, unmoving, taking his time. Jason sensed that it wasn't just slowness, it was some kind of insolent, provocative slowness, as if the old man were trying to piss him off. His youth and self-confidence pushed him to action. Why couldn't this old man realize that other people also wanted to go through and make their purchases? Why was he getting in everyone's way by continuing to stand still, as if he couldn't see anything around him? Jason realized that this situation was depressing him. He was sure that the old man simply had no right to behave like that in a public place. But then more violent thoughts began to enter his mind. For a moment, Jason saw him as a burden, an old man standing in the way, getting in the way of his life, preventing him from getting things done quickly and smoothly. Couldn't he just stand there without thinking about other people? Why not let him know how to behave? What if he, this old man, is missing something important in life, to realize how important it is to move forward, how important it is to keep up? These thoughts began to build up like a wave, pushing him to action. He knew he couldn't just walk by without doing something, without expressing his displeasure with this old man. Jason looked at the man with increasing aggression. His gaze grew harder, and an inner voice was pushing him to do something. He could have just turned away, but something in him wouldn't let him. A faint but defiant expression appeared on his face. He no longer saw the old man in front of him. For him, it was a symbol of what prevented him from moving forward, of what made his path difficult. He felt his chest fill with a sense of superiority, of self-righteousness. This was a fight he was ready to start. He could no longer stand next to this man, who seemed to be the living embodiment of everything that irritated him in this world. With his chin up, Jason stepped forward and asked his question, his voice not soft, but rather gruff and brash, as if he were punishing someone in his line of sight. With each word, he felt something evil growing inside him, ready to burst out. Jason couldn't take it anymore. The old man, standing silently like a statue, continued to look at the packages of pasta as if he had all the world and all day to choose the right product. It was unbearable. The inner irritation, growing with each passing moment, spilled outward. He didn't want to just walk by. He wanted to show this old man that his behavior was not normal, that everything around him was moving and he was stuck in the past, in his own slow time. Jason stepped forward, clutching the handle of the cart so tight his joints turned white. He couldn't let himself just walk by without saying something, without making that humiliating gesture. His voice sounded harsh and defiant as he began to speak. "Hey, old man, can't you see you're in the way?" His words were full of contempt. "Are you going to stand there forever? How long do you have to wait? Everything around you is in a hurry, and you're like a turtle," he continued, his face contorted with anger and insolence that grew with each word. "Stop standing there like an old stump and move. You probably don't realize that it's at least stupid and annoying." He didn't realize how hard his words would fall. He was too caught up in the moment, thinking that the old man just didn't get the point. Jason felt his rightness, his power. He was sure the old man would take his remark as a joke, a slight mockery, and everything would be fine. Just another unappreciated figure in the store he'd put in his place. But the old man didn't move, and his reaction wasn't what Jason had expected. The man didn't seem to hear a word he said. He continued to stare straight ahead, but there was something different in his eyes. He didn't seem upset or agitated. He just continued to stand there, as if the whole world around him could disappear and he wouldn't notice. But with each passing moment, Jason began to sense that something had gone wrong. His words were no longer lightly sarcastic. The tone was harsh, threatening. But most of all, it was a humiliation he didn't realize he was suffering. He didn't see just an old man in front of him, but something else, weak and vulnerable, on which he could vent all his anger. It was like a game, where his words weren't just offense, they became his way of feeling power, of control. But the more he continued, the colder his body grew. The old man remained unchanged, like a stone sculpture, but Jason kept feeling everything inside him start to change. He didn't know why, but something in his mind was screaming that he'd made a mistake. But it was too late. The old man turned his head slowly, almost forcefully, toward Jason. His eyes met the boy's. There was no anger in them, not what Jason had expected. But there was a silence that was far more dangerous than any shout or threat. Jason, no matter how hard he tried, couldn't look away. The old man didn't say a word, but there was something in his eyes that made his heart beat faster. It wasn't just silence. It was a silence filled with power and understanding, a silence that was far more powerful than the insults that came out of Jason's mouth. In that moment, he realized that his words weren't just hurtful. They had the potential to destroy. And when that realization crept into his mind, it was too late. Several seconds passed. The silence that hung in the air seemed to grow heavier and heavier. Jason stood across from the old man, waiting for him to say something, at least a word. After all, he thought, it was a light mockery, a little joke that shouldn't have affected anyone. But the old man simply remained silent. He didn't take offense, he didn't argue. He wasn't furious. He didn't insult Jason in return, as Jason had expected. That silence was the strangest thing the guy had ever felt. The old man continued to stare at the shelf, unmoving, showing no sign of agitation. His face expressed neither anger nor regret. It was a look that made one uncomfortable, because there was something hidden in it. Definitely not just indifference or senile infirmity. There was something in his eyes that Jason couldn't understand. Maybe he just didn't understand what I said. He thought, but his doubts grew stronger with each passing second. Why doesn't the old man react? Why did he continue to stand there like a rock, showing no emotion at all? Jason felt a wave of slight unease rise. His shoulders tensed a little, and he took a step back, trying to rethink what was happening. However, the feeling was quickly dismissed. He tried to calm down again, chase away the bad thoughts. He's just old, doesn't understand what I was saying, the boy reassured himself, trying to regain his confidence. After all, he was right. Old people usually don't understand what the young ones are saying, especially people like him, with their slowed perception. None of that mattered. But then why were the old man's eyes still not averted? Why wasn't he saying anything? Jason seemed to be beginning to see something in these chapters that wasn't simple at all. It was as if the old man were scanning him with his gaze, as if he were searching for something in him, as if he were reading every gesture, every word, every spark from his soul. Silently. No movement at all. Those eyes, the sharpness of them, seemed frightening, and Jason suddenly realized that there was more than indifference lurking in their depths. It wasn't just silence, it was a silence that made him feel like he'd fallen into the deepest hole, a hole he couldn't get out of unless he took a step back. But he couldn't. He didn't know how to do it. His breathing became a little more rapid. Tears of frustration, unrecognized, were forming somewhere in his soul, but Jason fought them away. Why didn't the old man answer? Why did he continue to stand there as if nothing had happened? The boy looked around the shelf again, feeling the tension growing in his body. He began to feel awkward, as if his place was lost in this place. He wished he could just walk away, but the old man's eyes, those penetrating, stone eyes, held him in their embrace, forcing him to stand. Jason didn't know what to do. The thought flashed through his mind again, maybe this isn't all that important. But his intuition told him otherwise. He didn't understand why the old man didn't react, why he didn't answer. And with each passing moment the silence became unbearable. The old man's silence became unbearable. There was no fear, no resentment, just a cold, incomprehensible calm that seemed to tear at Jason's mind. He couldn't believe that his words hadn't resonated in the slightest. The old man stood there like a stone statue, unmoving, with the same expression on his face, as if nothing Jason said mattered. But something inside the guy was starting to break. This silence, it was far more frightening than the shouting, than the retaliatory aggression. It was growing more ominous by the moment, and Jason could feel his confidence beginning to fade. He didn't understand what was happening. Why wasn't the old man reacting? Why wasn't he defending himself? It was too strange, too ridiculous. Swallowing hard, Jason finally took another step forward, deciding he had to put a stop to this strange silence. He couldn't let the old man go so easily, as if his insults meant nothing. Thoughts flashed through his mind again, full of irritation and even anger. It was the moment when everything he had been hiding in himself came out. Do you have any idea who's standing in front of you? Jason raised his voice with a scowl, an almost furious expression on his face. Are you trying to hold us all up? Time's long past for you, old man. Why are you even standing here, as if you don't have to go back to your ghetto, minding your own business? His words became much harsher, and with each word spoken with contempt, he could feel that aggression building up. He wasn't just mocking, he was trying to humiliate the old man to the core. You don't think you're that important, do you? You probably only have a bunch of friends and old memories there, so you hang out here while everyone else is doing important things. The word sounded like a blow, like a knife stabbing into his heart. Jason couldn't stop himself, his inner irritation turning to rage. He could feel the stereotypes he'd once heard from others coming out of his mouth. It wasn't just humiliation, it was a desire to break, to crush the old man, to show him that in his place there shouldn't be a single person who doesn't understand how the world works. Some terrible, ancient shadow passed over those words, and he felt that it was a step towards something far more terrible. The old man didn't move, didn't say a word. His body began to tense, though. Jason saw his hands clench into fists a little. Not really, not hard, but enough to feel the tension. It was so obvious that the guy couldn't ignore it. He could feel the threat building in the air. He could have tried to make excuses, to back away, but it was too late. The more the old man was silent, the more Jason felt his words tearing the space between them. He didn't know if it was fear or arousal, but his chest was starting to tighten. Something about that silence made him nervous, but he couldn't back down. An image of victory swirled in his mind, an image of how he could put the old man in his place, how he had to be right in this world. But the tension was building. The old man's hands became more and more tense, as if he was ready to do something at any second. It was more than just an old man who had lost his patience. It was the feeling that he was just waiting for the moment. The moment when his patience would run out. The moment when Jason himself would be trapped in the trap his words had created. Before we continue, let's take one more quick pause. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, and if you've had moments similar to what's happening in this story, share them. We're interested to hear how situations like this affect people in real life. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. And now we continue. Jason didn't notice how the atmosphere around him was beginning to change. He was too absorbed in his angry excitement, his anxiety, to pay attention to the way the people around him were beginning to stare. A few shoppers glimpsed him, but he wasn't ready to take in their gazes. He didn't care about them. The old man continued to stand motionless, and his silence only reinforced Jason's inner uncertainty. He could feel his confidence, which had been unshakable a moment ago, beginning to fray at the seams. The boy seemed convinced that it was all just a misunderstanding. He tried to convince himself that the old man didn't realize what he had said, that his words were just a minor taunt that shouldn't cause any serious consequences. But with every passing moment his confidence melted like ice under a hot sun. He continued to stare at the old man, his gaze growing more and more cruel. He couldn't back down. He needed to win this battle, to prove to himself that he was right. And the old man was too old and too weak to defeat him. As much as Jason tried to convince himself that he was right, the tension in the air was becoming more and more palpable. He began to notice people around him beginning to pay attention to what was happening. He saw a man standing near a shelf of meat freeze, staring at him in incomprehension. A woman with a child in her arms cast a concerned look at him, trying to hide her concern, but her gaze remained on him. Jason's eyes met for a moment with the clerk at the register, but he looked away, as if he didn't want to be seen in the conflict. These glances didn't just go by, they cut the air sharper, like knives. People were beginning to realize that something was wrong. But Jason didn't notice it. He was too self-absorbed to realize that this was no longer just a random situation in the store. It had become a spectacle to those around him. Every look, every glance he felt on him made him more and more certain that there were no consequences to his actions. He was right. He was strong. They just didn't realize how important his moment was. How important it was that he win. But with every look, with every movement of those around him, Jason could feel the tension building. He hadn't noticed how his own actions had begun to become a threat. The slight feeling that he'd done something wrong, which he tried to push away at the beginning, gradually began to weigh on him with every glance. Something in his body began to clench. There weren't many people, but everyone who happened to be around was watching him. And with every look of their judgment, with every look that was full of bewilderment and worry, Jason began to realize that this wasn't just a game. He might not have noticed it before, but now it was becoming apparent. The old man, despite his reticence, wasn't the only one involved in this situation. Everyone was now a spectator. The man standing next to the shelf of cereal, who seemed to see everything, couldn't look away. He ran his eyes over Jason a few times, then over the old man. The woman with the child was still watching the situation, as if trying to figure out whether to intervene. Jason felt his back begin to be covered in cold sweat. He still couldn't stop. He felt his pride continue to grow with every glance at the old man and his audience. His words were right, his actions right. He was young, he was stronger, he was right. And the old man couldn't beat him. He couldn't just stand there and be silent when Jason stood his ground. But at some point, his gaze crossed with the eyes of another customer, a young girl standing with bags in her hands at a rack of drinks. She gave him not just a look, but a look of fear and judgment. It was a look that seemed so vivid, so desperate, that Jason froze for a moment. It wasn't just a look of bewilderment. It was the look of a man who realized that something dangerous was happening, that the situation could get out of control. It was a look that told him he had stepped too far. At first, Jason didn't realize what was happening. But with every new look, with every movement of the people around him, he felt his confidence begin to press against his chest, as if this wasn't just a scene in a store, but something more serious. The words he spoke stopped seeming so insignificant to him. The fear he had been trying to push away was now becoming more and more real. His actions had become dangerous, not only to the old man, but to everyone around him. He could feel it, like an ominous wind gaining strength, but he couldn't and wouldn't stop. The silence in the store was becoming unbearable. Jason felt everything around him slowing down. Everything seemed to stop at this moment. Absorbed in his thoughts, he continued to stare at the old man, who didn't seem to be paying any attention to him. But suddenly, the old man moved. It was as if his body had come to life, and in that moment Jason realized that everything he'd been thinking about him no longer mattered. The old man slowly turned his head in his direction, and their gazes met. It was no ordinary gaze. It was a gaze filled with such power that Jason felt the air around him grow thick and tense. The boy's heart fluttered. He might have thought that the old man simply couldn't stand his aggression and would fight him now, but instead the old man just stood there, staring at him. All semblance of indifference was gone from his face. It became tense, hard as stone. The first few seconds were dragging. Jason stood frozen, unable to look away. He felt something heavy and ominous crawling into his mind. It was not anger, not fear, but something much deeper. It was like there was a whole world in the old man's eyes, filled with experiences Jason couldn't even begin to fathom. The old man finally broke the silence. His voice was low, calm, but there was such power in it that it came at Jason like thunder, shaking him from the inside out. "You think you can just talk to people any way you want?" he said. His words were soft, but there was a threat lurking in the shadows of every word. "You think your aggression is power?" Jason felt his body tense up a little. He wanted to answer, wanted to not hear those words, but he couldn't. Something in the old man's voice was so powerful that his words just penetrated everything inside. This wasn't just a conversation. It was a blow he hadn't expected. "You, young man, don't understand what's behind it," the old man continued, his voice becoming clearer and clearer. "You think that the world around you is a place where it is easy to humiliate and insult people. But you're wrong. And today you will learn that such words do not go away." Jason stood there, not knowing how to react. He could feel his confidence melting before his eyes. Every word the old man said made him more and more uncomfortable. These words weren't just a warning. There was such a heaviness in them that it seemed to become difficult for the boy to breathe. He realized that the old man wasn't just speaking as a hurt man, but as someone who knew something he didn't know. "I've seen your kind," the old man continued, his face now heavy with emotion. "You never realize the damage you can do with your words. Silently. Without effort. Just because you think you're right is all you need." Jason felt as if his body was being squeezed. All the old man's words penetrated his consciousness, and his pride began to crack. He realized he was part of something much bigger than just senseless aggression. And it was scary. Very scary. The old man went on, and each word he spoke became more and more determined. "I won't yell. I won't threaten you. I won't humiliate you like you humiliated me. But know this, I was where you are, years ago. I was in that place where every thought, every word seemed the most important, the most right. I was young too, full of aggression, full of contempt. I thought I could be strong and invincible. And that everything I said had a right to live." Jason felt his face go a little pale. The words penetrated his heart, and the more the old man spoke, the clearer it became that what he was experiencing wasn't just fright or shock. It was the realization that his world was being shattered. That his mere contempt and certainty of being right was worth less than he had ever imagined. "But I learned quickly," the old man continued, his voice harder. "I learned that power is not in words, not in the way you humiliate others. It's in being silent, in realizing what you carry within you. I've learned to respect the world I live in. And now that you think your words mean nothing, now that you've decided you can safely crush me, you're wrong. You don't see who I really am." For a moment, it was as if everything around him had frozen. Jason stood there, unable to say a word. His confidence evaporated, leaving him alone with this old man, who stood before him as if he weren't the person he wanted to humiliate. "I'm a detective, young man. And you just broke laws you don't even understand." At that moment, Jason realized that his words had become not just stupid, but dangerous. He was dumbfounded into silence as he realized that he was facing a man who had seen far more cruelty and prejudice in his life than he had ever imagined. And now it seemed the whole world had turned upside down. The old man looked up, unhurriedly, and Jason felt his face redden. The gaze was not only intense, but penetrating, as if the old man could see everything that lurked in his soul. All Jason could do was stay silent, reliving his mistake in the silence he'd created. The silence between them grew deeper and deeper. Jason stood there in a daze, not knowing what to say. His breathing was rapid, his mind was racing with thoughts, but none of them could articulate what was happening to him. His pride, his certainty that he was right, vanished like morning fog. And instead of justifying his actions, he felt only one thing, a strange uneasiness. All this time he had thought he was acting in his role, strong and invincible, but at this moment, under the old man's gaze, his world was crumbling. The old man took a small step forward, and Jason felt the tension building around them again. It was strange how it could affect him, a mere teenager, so much. He felt his hands begin to sweat, and his legs felt as if they were losing stability. Every word the old man spoke became like a hammer blow to him, ever more precise, ever harder. But when the old man spoke again, his words shook Jason to the core. "I said you don't understand who I am. Those aren't just words, young man. You have no idea who you're dealing with." The old man paused briefly and looked at him with a calmness that simply could not be ordinary. "My name is James Walker. I've been a detective for over 30 years. The words were like thunder to Jason. His thoughts drifted off, unsure of what was going on. He didn't know what to say. All the assumptions, all the judgments he'd made about the old man just vanished in an instant. He didn't know what was really standing in front of him. Everything he had heard about people like the old man now seemed to him to be absolute lies. James continued, but his voice sounded different now. It wasn't the same soft, calm tone. There was a heaviness to it now, an experience that couldn't be hidden. "I've worked in the major crimes unit. I have seen blood, I have seen pain, I have seen people break under the weight of their actions. I've seen the kind of brutality that can make a person lose their soul. I have seen things that would break many who would be in my shoes. I've been through death, through threats, through murder. And what do you think you're gonna do, scare me with something? Jason tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. He felt his legs go slack, as if his whole world had suddenly shrunk and was in the hands of this man who had been through so much. He felt so insignificant, so small, that maybe a second ago his aggression had just been the last weak resistance that he couldn't justify now. The old man took another step forward, but this time his face was hard, and his eyes seemed to penetrate Jason's very soul. He was no longer the old man on the shelf at the supermarket. He was something much bigger. Do you think that your aggression can be powerful, that your words can punish me? You think that by humiliating me, you have power? You're wrong, boy. There are always consequences behind words. And it's not always what you expect. At that moment, Jason felt his chest tighten. Something in the old man's voice, something in his tone and confidence, made him feel that now he might not get out of here. He was trapped. He didn't know what to do, how to get out of this situation, how to get away from this gaze that seemed to be omnipotent. The old man took a deep breath and continued. I could have just walked away, I could have ignored your aggression like I've done so many times in my life. But you chose the wrong path, kid. You chose me. You chose someone who has experienced and seen more than you can ever imagine. And now you're going to suffer the consequences. Jason felt his mind begin a frenzied whirling. He didn't know what the old man meant. He didn't know what it meant. But his words sounded like he was promising something that would change everything. He wasn't sure anymore if the old man was just talking like that. There was something about it all, scary, irreversible. He couldn't take his eyes off the old man, and at that moment he felt that he was not only in control of the situation, but also of himself. James Walker, a detective with 30 years of experience, understood one important thing Jason couldn't fathom. He knew how to behave in these situations. He knew how to handle aggression and he knew how to handle violence because he had faced it every day of his career. He knew that word and action were two different worlds. But he also knew that at a certain point those worlds collide and the consequences become inevitable. The old man took another step forward, and Jason felt his heart beat faster. He didn't know what to expect. But despite his fear, he couldn't back down. You won't be the first to face the consequences of your words, Jason, the old man said, his voice quiet but powerful. But you will be the first to realize that every word can change your life. And believe me, you won't forget that lesson. And then, in that moment, as Jason realizes the gravity of his words, everything around him begins to change. It was a moment that would turn everything upside down. With every word the old man said, Jason felt his world begin to crumble. He stood before him, stunned, unable to move. His body felt like it was shackled. Everything that was happening felt like a strange dream where he was losing control of himself. He could feel his face burning with shame, his pride blurring away like a fog, leaving only emptiness. He wanted to respond, to say something in his defense, but the words wouldn't come out. Every time he tried to open his mouth, his own thoughts shrank, as if the old man was not just a man, but the living embodiment of all the pain and lessons he was about to learn. Jason tried to talk himself into thinking that none of this was a big deal, that he could get out of this situation like he always did. He was sure that the people around him didn't understand how it really was. But the old man was in no hurry to back down. He stood there as if he knew everything that was going on in Jason's head, and his silence was scarier than any threats. He was ready for that moment when the guy would realize his mistake, but he didn't say anything. He knew that time and understanding would do the trick. Suddenly everything around him seemed to freeze. Jason, despite his growing sense of dread, dared to look up and meet the old man's eyes. But now it wasn't just any man's eyes, but a gaze filled with lessons, heavy and painful, like a cold wind that penetrates to the very soul. Do you want to understand what's going on? Do you want to realize that your behavior can't go without consequences? The old man's voice was quiet, but there was a power in it that made Jason stand still, as if in a daze. Are you sure that all your behaviors will be forgiven just because you're younger, or are you sure of yourself? Do you think the world will accept your cynicism and aggression? He couldn't fight the feeling that came over him like a wave. He felt his pride gradually recede, replaced by a realization. A realization that the world would not forgive his arrogance. He saw how his actions turned into something terrible, how his own words began to destroy not only the old man, but his own life. With each passing moment he realized that he had become what he despised. He thought he was strong, but now he realized that strength was not in words or in insulting others. Strength was in understanding his actions and being able to accept responsibility for them. The old man went on, and every word he spoke sounded like a blow penetrating to the heart. You grew up in a world where things often seem to go unpunished. You think that being young, bold and confident is enough for the world to adjust to you. But you're wrong. With every action you take, you create your own destiny. And these are the consequences of your words, your behavior. You hurt me, but that's just the beginning. This lesson will be with you for the rest of your life, unless you realize that words can destroy more than you can imagine. Jason stood there, pondering the old man's words, and realized how much his life had changed in that moment. He was broken, but at the same time, something inside him began to change. He realized that he could no longer be the person he used to be. He could no longer allow himself to be careless, irresponsible. He realized that his every thought, his every action could affect other people. He was no longer isolated from the world. His actions affected everyone, and now that realization fell on his shoulders like a stone. You don't realize that each of us is responsible for our words, for our actions, the old man continued. And if you don't learn to respect that, you will lose more than you can imagine. But if you do, you will become a different person. And that person will be much stronger than the person you were before. Jason was silent. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to justify his actions. All he could feel was the weight of realization. He felt a fracture happening inside of him. He was no longer a teenager who could mock others with impunity. He had become a man who faced the fact that his actions had a price, that there would be a price to pay for everything he did. After a little silence, Jason lowered his head. He was completely confused, but at the same time he felt that this was something he had to experience. This was the moment that would force him to become an adult, teach him responsibility for every word, every deed. The old man's lesson was important, painful, but necessary. And though it was hard to accept, it was the only right thing to do. The old man did not continue. He knew that the words had already been said, and that this moment would remain in Jason's memory forever. He turned and began to walk away slowly, leaving the young man standing in silence, realizing that every action he took had consequences. When Jason was left alone, he felt like this event would be a turning point in his life. He knew that now he would have to learn to live with this lesson. And though it was hard, he knew it was necessary. What do you think about this story? Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? It is very important for us to know what you think, because every comment means a lot to us. We value each and every one of you, and your opinion helps us to become better. If you liked the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give us a like. Write in the comments the phrase, "I understood the lesson," so we know you listened to the end. We wish you a good day and look forward to seeing you again.